the room populate. I always love seeing the doors open and folks coming in. I miss the faces, but it's always good to see folks.
They're streaming in now. They are streaming in.
They are. We've
Yes,
got
indeed.
Anthony and Debbie and Aaron, couple of Aarons. I love that. Lacey and Shelly and Sherry. Hey guys, as you're coming in, throw into a chat the answer to the question of what makes you smile this morning. When you first got started working, what was the first thing that made you smile? What was the first thing that made you smile? So let's go ahead and share that. Hi, Shelly. Thank you for jumping on chat and getting us started. We got a great conversation ahead. I have primed Peter, and he is ready to go and to share some really good content here.
I tested out my story with the cicadas yesterday, and it was just a standing ovation. They were all up in arms, making all kinds of crazy noise. It was great.
Oh, Debbie, I love that. Walking the dogs. Always nice to kind of get out there and just have some cool stuff. That's great. Ooh, Shelly's got a calendar full of meetings, but she said this one's really good. Nice weather from William. Excellent. Yeah, so Wednesdays is we call it Workout Wednesdays. We go to a trainer. And so I smiled today because he has this new thing called the agility star. And he puts all these little lights on the floor, and then you have to run to them and turn them off based on the color. And it was just so much fun. If you have to work out, you might as well have some fun. So that's what made me smile. No rain. Awesome. We are getting some folks in here, lots of names I recognize, and a bunch that are maybe newbies. Hey, Michelle, I hope that annual meeting went well. I think it's been finished at this point. Tracy's on. Good to see you, Tracy. Got Julie and Judy. Hi. And number of folks. Yeah, it's always good. So guys, we're just throwing into the chat what makes you smile. Michelle says, yes, that they had a good annual meeting, and doesn't that always make us feel good when we've had something that's easy to smile? So Jana, I see your name popping in. That is awesome. We've got about a minute to go. So folks, grab your beverage of choice. Tell us what made you smile this morning so we can start off with some good big grins. And we will let a few
Jason's kids make him smile. I wonder how old those kids are. I'm gonna guess they're under 10, because when they're under 10, they still love you.
Yes. And guys, just a quick note, as we go, we always, for those of you who have been with us, you know the chat is usually on fire, and Peter's got lots of questions he's going to ask you today. When you are responding so that all the groups can see, everybody can see, go ahead and respond to all panelists and attendees. 10, 10, and 8. So Jason's got some twins. That's got to make you smile. I love it. I love it. Oh, Aaron. You don't even know, Peter. We could show our fish. That's the only pet we have here. We have a whole wonderful group thing of fish. I don't know if they're going to be able to see it, Peter.
No, they're not going to be able to see them unless I turn everything off. So yeah. We'll try that some other time.
Yep. Oh, Jill, the second time this week. Actually, we're great to see you again. Absolutely. Okay, Peter, we got 12 o'clock on the top, so let me turn it over to you. I'm going to go off video, so Peter's going to be the star. Super excited to get started here, and over to you, Peter.
Hey, so drive chapter behavior with targeted benchmarking. So what is benchmarking? Well, according to Webster, benchmarking is setting a standard by which others may be judged. Setting a standard by which others may be judged. We're all about comparing, right? We're comparing A to B. My horse is faster than your horse. My dad's stronger than your dad. My chapter is better than your chapter. Well, maybe we want to think a little differently about this. So when I was a kid, my parents used to play this game called Scrabble, Scrabble. I can't remember how many points you get for that, but at any rate, it's a game some of you may have heard of. If you haven't, Google it. But they played Scrabble in a different way. They used to play with another couple they really enjoyed playing together, and their goal was not to beat each other. Their goal was to beat the board, to get the best possible score as a group that they could get. They were thinking as a team. And when we talk today about chapter benchmarking, I'm going to suggest maybe we need to think differently about what benchmarking should be used for. How can we help our chapters beat the board, as it were? So hang on there. We're going to get there. But first, we have a word from some of our great sponsors. And today our sponsors are, surprise, Bill Highway and Mariner. Bill Highway helps you get the data. Mariner helps you figure out what it all means. Be sure to check out our websites for all those wonderful details. And speaking of details, mark your calendars on June 30th. My partner, Peggy Hoffman, will be working with the Bill Highway folks to help you map your volunteer learning journey from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. There's a link that I think will probably be available in the chat at some point or other. There it is. Thanks, Sarah. And also don't forget that on June 3rd, Friday, June 3rd, Mariner and Bill Highway will be collaborating at the MMC and looking at bright spots. And how can we take our chapters that are really knocking it out of the park and replicate their performance across our entire chapter system? So with all that said, then, hey, who's that guy? That's your presenter, Peter Houstel. I'm the CEO of Mariner Management. I'm also the executive director of two associations, the Metro DC chapter of the Appraisal Institute and the Maryland Recycling Network. They're two of our management consulting or management clients. We spend actually most of our time these days talking to associations about their chapters and about their volunteers. And usually those two things find a way to blend together. But one of the cool things about this job of managing these two associations is we work with volunteers and chapters every single day. When I was CEO of a national association many moons ago, I had a variety of chapters, and I think I hated all of them. I'm not sure I hated all of them, but I hated most of them. They didn't seem to want to do what I wanted them to do. They seemed to want to do their own thing. And of course, that drove me absolutely crazy because I was the CEO of the National Association. Why aren't they bending to my will? Suffice to say, I never figured that one out. And I'm beginning to figure that out now. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So if we take a look at our agenda, we want to think about what is effective. When we look at our chapters, which chapters are actually effective? What does that word mean? And how are we trying to move our chapters towards effectiveness as opposed to activeness? And then what do we assess? What are we counting? And why are we counting it? And how do we benchmark? And now today's conversation is not about comparing association chapter systems to each other. Today's conversation is about how we compare our chapters to each other to identify who's knocking it out of the park, where are the bright spots, and how can we replicate those bright spots. So those three areas: what's effective, well, what do we assess, how do we count things, and how do we benchmark, how do we compare? So I'd like you in the chat just to take a minute and think of your absolute favorite chapter. Think of your absolute favorite chapter. What makes that chapter stand out for you? What is it that really makes you go, oh, that's my favorite chapter? Let's see the chat roll with that. Positivity from the leaders, communication, awesome people. Okay, strong leadership. Thanks, Jenny. Collaboration, volunteer engagement, connected to mission. Connected to mission. I love that. Actually reply to our emails. Support of the mission, the strategic plan. Coachable volunteers. Yes, indeed. They're malleable. They will, and Jason, your kids are malleable right now in about 4 or 5 years. Engage with the global organization. support of the national vision and mission. Yes, these are all really important things and actually adds value locally. And we're working on a 2021 chapter benchmarking study, but this time we're going about it a little bit differently. And we just completed 2 CEO roundtables. And we were asking them, why do you have chapters? What's the purpose they serve? What's the value they create? And what makes an effective chapter? So we really hope to really dig deeply across the community with this whole notion of chapter effectiveness. But I would ask the question, if the chapter is your favorite, does it mean it's effective? Does it actually get the job done? And what job is it doing that it's getting done? So we want to take a look at this word effective and try to get some sense of what we're trying to get to right now. And part of the problem we struggle with is it's sometimes hard to differentiate between chapter activity and meaningful results. Chapters may do a lot of things, but do they make a difference? Do they move the needle? Do they help the member? Do they move the mission? We have some chapters that do all kinds of things all the time, and some chapters that do relatively few things. But some of the chapters that do a lot of stuff don't do it very well. And some of the chapters that do just a few things do those things really well, and they make a substantial difference in our effort as an organization to move our mission. So let's take a look for a minute. And I'm going to go back to our chapter benchmarking, our study in the past. Let's do a poll here, Sarah. What do you currently measure? When you're measuring your chapters, what are the metrics that you're trying to get your arms around? Administration, do they dot the I's and cross the T's? Awareness, do their members know that they exist? Activity, do they do stuff? Engagement, do their members participate? It's usually a tough one for people to get their arms around. Satisfaction, do their members like what they do? And retention, do their members renew? And renewal or growth, do they attract new members? And I would suggest most importantly, their mission. Do they do things that actually move the mission? Okay, so I'm looking at our tally so far, and it looks like activity is probably the one that's in the lead, closely followed by retention and growth, and then administration behind that. Awareness and satisfaction and the mission are way in the back of the pack. Looks like about 3/4 of our folks have voted. The popcorn in the microwave looks like it's about stopped. So Sarah, why don't you share these results? So we can see that we like to measure activity. Are they doing stuff? So lots of times we'll count how many meetings did you have? How many events did you have? How many golf tournaments did you have? How many whatever did you do? And those and I'm not suggesting those aren't important things to measure, but we want to make sure that they're ultimately tied back to the mission, right? And yes, indeed. So mission was sort of I guess it was not quite last, but it was very close to last. So we're going to talk today about how we can get to that. So let's keep moving through our slide deck, and we can go ahead and close that poll out and go to our next slide and ask another poll. How are most of your metrics collected? How do you know they do what they do? Are they self-reporting? Are you working on a shared data platform or common system so everything is generated for you, or some combination of the above? And usually the self-reported stuff is the stuff that drives us nuts when we're managing chapters, right? Because we're not sure whether to believe them or not. And way too often we feel like we're pulling teeth. They're reluctant to share the data with us. And so that makes we sort of get into an us and them conversation, and we're the bad guy, we're the bad cop, and they're going, why are you beating up on me about this silly report that you want me to do? So when I look at the numbers so far, it looks like self-reported is about half the group, and some combination of the above is right behind that. And a few people have a shared data platform and common systems. And you've probably heard me say numerous times, let's get ourselves on a common platform. Let's have shared data. Let's count the same things the same way, so that we all, when we say, I've got 20 apples, I actually have 20 apples, not 20 aardvarks. Okay, yeah. Thanks, Sarah. And yes, you can see that the self-reporting is still the dominant way in which we get our information from our chapters. So that does limit us in many cases because, first of all, Some chapters are not terribly sophisticated about how they count things. It may be that they're working on probably Post-it notes, which you can't see because they're green, or they could be working on Excel spreadsheets. Some have sophisticated data management systems, but that's probably the exception, not the rule. Okay, let's go to our next poll then, Sarah. How do you actually use the results of your benchmarking? How do you use the results? Do you spotlight successes? Do you do remedial training? Do you offer financial rewards? Do people get rebates because, or any kind of financial anything based on how they perform? Do they get additional support if they need it, or whether they need it or not? Do you cut the cord? And that's we haven't seen too many associations willing to cut the cord, but there are lots of times when I'm wondering, why are you keeping this group around? They don't seem to be doing much. And then there's some other things that they may be doing. And Jill noted that their chapters have to file a report to get the due share, and that's a pretty common pair of handcuffs that we put on chapters when we're trying to get them to toe the line, as it were. Okay, and it looks like Spotlight Success is at the lead of the pack, and that's great to hear, because I think going back to this notion of we want to beat the board in Scrabble, we're not trying to beat each other. I think the goal is how do we show everybody what's working well and create an incentive for them to go down that same road. And I see Aaron, if a chapter is inactive, we demote them to a networking group. And if they cannot recover, we dissolve the group. So at least there is sort of a hierarchy of consequences to their performance. And that's important, because I think accountability is something that we tend to shy away from a lot of times when we're working with both chapters and with volunteers. Okay, so Spotlight Successes was definitely number one. Additional support was right there at the top. And there were a few folks that actually cut the cord. Cool. Thank you very much. Okay, good stuff. So let's take this conversation in a slightly different direction here and talk about what we're counting. And lots of times we count lots of things, and we're not really sure if there are things that actually count. And I think it's important we count the things that reflect meaningful effectiveness. And I'm going to tell you the story of a tale of two chapters, as it were. And I'm not going to say who this chapter is, but who this association is. I don't want to embarrass anybody, but I think it's an important story. This association they have an operations manual for their chapter that's 160 pages long, 160 pages of operations stuff for their chapters to deal with. The word mission, I think, appears maybe a handful of times, and there's no real discussion about how are we setting goals and how those goals drive the mission of the organization. And they have these things they call minimum requirements. If you want to stay in business, this is what you got to do on an ongoing basis. And there are absolutely no mission or member service metrics inside those minimum requirements. They're all about organizational compliance. Am I dotting my I's? Am I crossing my T's? Well, in 2020, you may all remember there was this pandemic thing that came along. And there were two chapters that were literally sort of side by side. And one chapter basically did nothing. They went into hibernation, but they did all the minimum requirements things. They filed all their reports. They dotted all those I's and crossed all those T's. The other chapter went out and said, hey, our members need our help. So they went out and they had a whole series of town halls. They brought in experts from all over the place to talk about, what's an essential worker? Can I do my job? How can I do my job? What are the things I need to do? They posted things on their website. They referred to lots of other resources people could go to stay in business, to keep doing what they wanted to do, to keep doing their job and making a living. They burned a lot of calories in this space, but they got zero credit for that, because the minimum requirements, the system that this association has in place, doesn't recognize them for doing things that move the mission to serve the member. And in fact, at the end of the year, they had not had, quote unquote, a chapter meeting. Now, a chapter meeting is a time when we bring the members together and we talk about chapter business. And that really doesn't have anything to do with member business or mission business. And so they were actually threatened with losing their dues rebate because they didn't have 4 chapter meetings. And that's where I think we get ourselves twisted into a knot that really isn't serving the community. Going back to our game of Scrabble, our goal is to beat the board. How can we be a team? How can we think of our chapters as a team? How can we help the chapters themselves think of themselves as part of a team? And the minute we fail to recognize what's important to them, we begin to lose sight of what it actually means to be a team. So the key here then is looking at strategic effectiveness. And there are a variety of ways in which we can measure that. And one of the areas that we talk about a lot is alignment. And that's really one of the major themes of this conversation. How do we get everybody pointed in the same direction, shooting for the same goals? And so that's where we need to have a shared vision and a shared mission. And you find this in the business. This is not just an association thing. This is in the business world generally. The most successful businesses are those where the culture of the organization has a clear and well-defined focus on the organizational mission and vision. Everybody from the CEO down to the janitor who cleans the toilets all understand this is what we're all about. This is why we do what we do. In our 2019 benchmarking survey or 2018 benchmarking survey, slightly more than half of the respondents reported that their chapters were usually well aligned, which means that almost half were not usually well aligned, which is, we want to fix that one, right? And of course, we also look at quality control. Over and over again, we will hear about this concern that the member experience varies significantly from chapter to chapter. And we want our members, wherever they are, to get the best possible experience with our organization. We want the value proposition from the member's perspective to be the best it can be. And in our survey, again, 29% of the respondents scored their chapter systems in the top 2 quintiles with respect to quality, while the majority, 70% said, not so much, not that great, pretty uneven. And again, we want to have good, even quality across the system and high quality. And of course, is the juice worth the squeeze? Are the results worth the effort? Only a third in our 2019 survey of the respondents suggested that their chapters actually were worth the effort that they were putting forth. So that just doesn't sound right to me. We need to fix that. We need to come to an agreement about what the ROI should be and find a way to get there. And then last but not least, we all look at risk mitigation. And that's a place where we're all trying to make sure that they don't do anything that's going to get us all thrown in jail or get all their members sued for something or other. And again, what we found was, and this speaks well to risk mitigation, in that 4% rated their chapters risk-free, 74% said there were only occasional missteps. So what I'm suggesting here is I think most chapter leaders want to do the right thing, and they're going to do the right thing most of the time. But we certainly burn a lot of calories trying to make sure that they do it. We try to put some handcuffs on them to push them to report to us, oh yes, I'm doing all the right things the right way. Of course, the downside of that is if you're going 0 miles an hour, you have 0 risk, right? If you're not moving, you have 0 risk. But when you have 0 risk, you have 0 reward. So where's that place on that speedometer where we can be moving at a good pace, but not at such a risky pace that we run off the road and have that accident? And I think most of us, and most chapter leaders and most chapter execs, want to do the right thing. We want to drive at a safe speed, but we want to get there. We want to get there. So why do we assess? Why do we benchmark? Or to rephrase this, why do we count and compare? Why do we count and compare? Well, there's 3 valid reasons that we want to focus on today. And the first one is simply to focus attention on what's truly important. And one of the struggles that Peggy and I often have when we're working with organizations trying to address this issue of chapter benchmarking is when we look at their system, it doesn't really tell you what's important. It just has this long checklist of things that you're supposed to do. And there's no hierarchy of those things. And having bylaws, submitting your minutes could be as important as delivering a good advocacy program in the state capitol. But I would say those things are nowhere near each other. I would say the advocacy piece is far and away the far more important if that's critical to your mission. Because again, if you're dotting those administrative I's and crossing those bureaucratic T's, but you're not moving the mission, who cares? So we want to help make sure our chapter leaders, our execs, our volunteer leaders understand what's important. And then, of course, we want to identify the bright spots. And I'll remind you again, June 3rd at MMC, Mariner and Bill High will be talking about bright spots. How do we replicate them? How do we take those chapters that are knocking it out of the park and help others look just like them? Again, how do we beat the board? And then last but not least, we want to make sure the juice is worth the squeeze. We want to be sure that what we're doing is worth the effort. And most importantly, we want to make sure what the volunteers are doing is worth the effort. You know, Peggy and I are both passionate about volunteers, and we hate to see volunteer calories burned without creating any useful heat. So let's make sure that our chapters are doing the right things. And that all comes back to this notion that you need to measure what matters. If you're trying to lose weight, and yeah, you want to probably count your calories, you want to exercise, but if you're not losing weight, then are you counting the right things? We want to make sure that we're counting the things that actually make a difference. And usually eating the right stuff, reducing the calories, exercising, that's going to help you reduce weight, but not always. And if it's not helping you reduce weight, then you got to figure out, well, what is it that's can help me reduce weight? I need to look at some of the other metrics. As you probably heard any number of times, you can't manage what you can't or don't measure. And Peter Drucker or Jack Welch or one of those people said that. At least that's what I understand. And of course, if you don't measure it, you can't improve it. And that's really what we're trying to do here, right? We want to improve things. So in order to improve them, we have to start with it. What's the baseline? Where are we starting? How do we make it better? And of course, experience tells us over and over and over again, we tend to manage what we measure. We tend to manage what we measure. If you wear a Fitbit, you're going to count your steps. And you're going to try to get 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 steps. That's where your head's going to be focused. I want to make that number show up on my Fitbit because that's what my Fitbit is telling me to do. So if we're measuring the right things, that's great. But what if we're measuring the wrong things? Remember the tale of two chapters, right? Chapter A, they were meeting all the minimum requirements. Chapter B was moving the mission and serving the member. But chapter A was getting rewarded for dotting I's and crossing T's that had nothing to do with moving the mission and serving the member. So we really struggle with this question, what do we focus on, the organizational metrics or the mission metrics? Or do we focus on both? And I think as you'll see as we go through this, we need to focus on both. We can't ignore risk management. But the question is not, do we ignore it? The question is, where do we place our emphasis? And I think that's the paradigm we want to shift today. Again, I'll go back to the Scrabble metaphor. We want to beat the board, not each other. Risk mitigation is critical. But if we focus solely on risk, we would never have gone to the moon. Never. The faster you drive, the sooner you get there. It may be faster, it may be safest to go 0 miles an hour, but you're not going to get to the moon that way. You're not going to get to Glen Burnie that way, for that matter. And there's another equally important question for us to take a look at, and that's the question of effort versus results. Do we want to focus on effort, how hard they try, or results? How much do they actually get done? And that's a tough question because sometimes, if everybody's a winner, nobody's a winner. Again, we're back to are we comparing people, trying to figure out who's better, or are we trying to figure out how we can all be better? Or do we want to look at both? And I think there are reasons for us to look at both because results are important. If everybody's making the effort, but we're not getting the results, then we need to do something different. So I'll go back to our 2018, chapter benchmark metrics. These were the things that we looked at back then. And this is what it showed most associations were putting at the top of their list, as it were. And you see that bylaws was at the top of the heap. Everybody looks at bylaws. Leadership positions filled. seemed like an important thing. I can sort of agree that that could be an important thing. But again, if the leadership positions are filled, but they're not doing anything, who cares? Membership retention, membership recruitment was pretty high up there. But then let's ask ourselves the question, how many people have had chapters that knocked it out of the park when it came to membership recruitment? In my experience, very few have actually pulled that one off. I've only seen that work really well in federations, where basically the chapters, which are the source of membership for the headquarters organization, are the ones that drive membership, and it's in their best interest to have lots of members. Or I remember the entrepreneurs organization, and I emphasize the word entrepreneurs organization, were offered a competitive opportunity to make an additional $10,000 for their chapter if they could get their membership recruitment numbers up to a certain level. But generally, the experience that Peggy and I have had is that chapters are not the greatest membership recruitment tools for an organization. And you look through this list of things that we were measuring, and there are not too many mission-related things in here that seem to float to the top. Lots of stuff like insurance, branding agreements, filing an annual report, getting yourself incorporated. All that stuff was rated pretty highly. But is that really critical to moving the mission and serving the member? So I think we need to focus first on the mission. That's really critical. Focus first on the mission. So let's do a quick poll here. Are the majority of your chapters run by paid staff, volunteers, or not sure? Okay, it looks like volunteers are way in the lead here. Way up at the top of the pile. Yes, indeed. Not too many run by paid staff. So looks like the majority of our folks have weighed in here, and it looks like most of the chapters of the folks that are on the call today are run by volunteers. And why is that important? Well, let's think about this question of what we're asking them to focus on. What's important to our volunteers? Well, our volunteers care about the mission. It's why they're here. It's what they care about. If you want to get a volunteer leader to go someplace for you, you got to reach their heart. You got to go for their passion. And their passion, quite frankly, is not in articles of incorporation, meeting minutes, annual reports, any of that stuff. They just don't care about that stuff. They care about why they joined the organization in the first place. And that's all about the mission. So we need to focus on what they care about, not what we care about. That's the way we drive alignment. If we all have that shared vision and mission, alignment's pretty easy to get. It allows people to really focus on where they're trying to go and not necessarily all pick the same direction or the same method of transportation. We want to emphasize purpose rather than process. Emphasize purpose rather than process. And we want to be flexible about how they get it done. This is all about celebrating different. This is really where we really tap into the collective wisdom and creativity of our system, of our team. We allow everybody in the team to bring it. We allow, and actually we encourage our chapters to try things out. And failure is okay. If we're too stuck on risk mitigation, failure is not okay. So the less emphasis we place on risk mitigation, the more likely we're going to encourage our chapters to try things out and discover some bright spots that maybe we wouldn't have come across at all. And Cindy also makes the note, allowing large, medium, and small chapters to participate equally. And I think that's, sometimes we tend to differentiate based on a variety of dimensions, size being one of them. And I think those dimensions may be important in terms of the resources they can bring to the table, but it is not important with respect to the creativity and the ideas that they can bring to the table. Sometimes the smallest of chapters are the most fleet and nimble and creative. Let's take advantage of all of our chapters, regardless of where they are, how big they are, how many members they have, any of those dimensions. So in the chat, I'd like you to go ahead and this is a test. This is a test. What is your association's mission? And you don't need to do the whole paragraph thing. Let's see if we can condense that mission down to 1 or 2 sentences. Let's take a look at some association missions here. I see everybody's scrambling now. They're alt tabbing to their improve the quality of health information, promote professionalism, excellence, and civility in the legal profession, empower grant professionals. ASRT is advance and elevate medical imaging and radiation therapy profession and to enhance the quality and safety of patient care. Connect people and organizations across borders to save and change lives. Promoting fire protection science, the profession of fire protection engineers. Knowledge, resources, empower. Make the world a better place. These are all very powerful statements. These are all powerful whys. But we have to ask ourselves, how do we tie these whys, these missions, to our metrics? How do we make these two things fit together? Because you look at these things and you say, well, how am I going to measure that? And to what extent can I hold my chapters at all responsible for moving the mission? That's a tough one. That's a tough one. So let's try to make the connection. And I'm gonna pick on an organization that I happen to be, of which I happen to be the executive director, because that's what we're trying to do here. And that's the Maryland Recycling Network. And right away, you can see the green theme here. So that there's sort of an environmental cause at play here that one can wrap one's arms around. But I can tell you, looking at all the other missions that we see out there, every single one of them has a cause embedded in it. There's a place where I bet you from the member's perspective, their heart is in it. Regardless of what the profession or the industry may be, they're passionate about what they do. And that's why they step up and they want to work with work as volunteers for their chapters. So in the case of the Maryland Recycling Network, their mission is to promote the sustainable reduction, reuse, and recycling in Maryland. Those are the 3 R's. We've all heard about them: reduce, reuse, recycle. Pretty simple sort of focus for the organization. And their vision, and this is important, their vision is that materials otherwise destined for disposal in our state are reused or recycled. In other words, they're not going into the landfill. They're not going into an incinerator. They're actually continuing to create value for our society. And there are all kinds of great consequences of this mission and vision for our environment. And this is why the members of MRN are passionate about what they do. They get excited about this. So our metrics are really focused on how do we get there. And so again, what do we measure here? How do we tell this has happened? Well, you can actually, there are measurables sitting inside of this. And I challenge every one of you to take a look at your missions and figure out where the measurables are there and how you can tie them back to your chapters. So if we look at the Maryland Recycling Network, we have a couple of key metrics that they pay a lot of attention to. And these are actually measured by the Maryland Department of the Environment. And one is the waste diversion rate, and the other one is the recycling tonnage. How much stuff is not going into the landfill and how much of that stuff that's not going to landfill is being recycled. And implicit in that, particularly in the waste diversion question, is reduction, because the smaller the pile of stuff going into the system, the better. So those are the 2 key metrics that we look at, and we say, okay, to what extent are we moving that one way or the other? Now, if you think about that from the Maryland Recycling Network's perspective, and they're a small organization, they don't have a big budget, they have a staff of, let me count me. Actually, me and Peggy and Carol. So the 3 of us work for MRN, and quite frankly, we are as passionate about MRN as I think the volunteers are. But that's important for us. But we recognize that our ability as an association to directly affect the diversion and recycling rates in Maryland is somewhat limited. right? Because the government does some things that might make a difference. Private sector does some things that might make a difference. And oh, those citizens out there, they do lots of things that could make a big difference. But sometimes we have a hard time helping them understand that. I remember the recycling coordinator for Baltimore City complaining to me one time. He said, I'll put out a trash can and a recycle bin on the street, and I'll go by it the next day, and there's lots of trash and recyclable materials, and they're all on the sidewalk. So our ability to move that mission and serve that member sometimes is somewhat limited. But these are the things that we focus on. And I would suggest that we want to help our chapter leaders focus first and foremost on what are the key mission metrics of our association, and how are those metrics doing, and how can they contribute? Well, that question of how can they contribute is what I want to tackle next, because there are actually some very specific things that they may be doing. And it's not going to be the same across chapters. It's going to depend upon where their interest is, where their capacity is, where their skill, experience, et cetera are. So in the case of MRN, as you might expect, advocacy is very important. The Maryland General Assembly is in session 90 days of the year, though any legislator will tell you that it's not a 3-month session by a long shot. In fact, I had one legislator tell me the next time somebody tells me this is a 3-month-a-year job, I'm going to shoot him in the expletive deleted. But in the course of that 90 days, they pass something on the order of, I don't know, 700 or 800 different pieces of legislation, and consider over 2,000. So it's kind of it's that proverbial, you're watching the making of sausage. But in the case of MRN, we're really saying, how do we make sure that legislation is getting through that is supporting, this driving the 3 R's? And equally importantly, how do we make sure that there's legislation that's getting through that's not obstructing the 3 R's? And that's where we burn our calories. We spend a fair chunk of time doing that. And we can count the number of bills that get passed that we like, and we can count the number of bills that get proposed that don't get passed. Those are 2 very countable things. And we measure them every year. That's very important to us to make sure we've got the right ratio of good stuff to not so good stuff. And ideally, that not so good stuff is as close to 0 as it could possibly be. That's not the only thing that we do. The other place that we go, of course, like most associations, we're in the education business. We want our members to learn how to do things better, faster, cheaper, et cetera. So our metric is a well-attended, highly rated conference, workshops, webinars, and tours, which build our members' expertise in the 3 R's. Those are all measurables. We can count how many events that we put on, but more importantly, how many people attend, and most importantly, how satisfied they are, how much value they get from the things that they attend. So Peggy and I often see associations that will count how many events their chapters do. And I'm going, okay, that's great. How many events did they do? But did they help their members get better? How many people actually showed up? And what's their market penetration? What percentage of their members actually show up at things? So those are important subsidiary metrics that we can look at when we look at this question of education. How well are we serving the members? Those are really the 2 things that MRN does. Are there other things it could do? Could it do a public relations campaign? Sure. Probably doesn't have the dollars to do it very well, but it could be another check mark on that list, right? If public relations campaigns were on that list, it could have golf tournaments. It could do all kinds of things that they don't have the resources or the interest, quite frankly, in doing. But these are things, advocacy and education, that make a significant difference for the Maryland recycling community. And that's where we burn our calories. So that's where I think, in terms of what are we measuring, why are we measuring it, we want to have that mission related focus. And I think if each of you took your mission and said, where are the metrics sitting inside of that? How could I take those metrics and put them in front of my chapters and help my chapters move those metrics in the right direction? You'd be surprised at how many great places things could be different than they are right now. So the ideal benchmarking hierarchy obviously starts with a mission, right? And what are the activities then that drive that mission? And last and least, I'm not saying unimportant, but last and least, we look at the organizational metrics. Are they dotting the I's, crossing the T's? Do they have their insurance policy in place? All that kind of fun stuff. That's interesting stuff, but from a volunteer leader's perspective, that's the stuff that's I really just don't want to burn calories on unless I absolutely have to. I will only do that. I will only do that if doing that is essential to helping me move the mission and serve the member. That's where my eyes are focused. So I want to ask each of you for your homework assignment. I want you to go look at all your chapter metrics. What are you measuring? And do you measure what matters? To what extent is that hierarchy, is that list of things in a hierarchy that places the mission first? Or is there any hierarchy at all? Remember, if everything's important, then nothing is important. So I think that's critical to making sure that our volunteer leaders understand where we're trying to go and getting them excited about the mission and the vision of the organization every time we talk to them. If you have a dashboard, does that dashboard put the mission right at the top and show how we're doing on that mission? And then show the activities that the chapters as a group, as a team, are putting on to drive that mission forward. The more we can help them see themselves as part of our organization, not separate from our organization, the more likely they are to stay aligned and focused on where we think they should go. Ultimately, if you want to drive chapter behavior with targeted benchmarking, you need to measure what matters. Measure what matters. Okay, guys, it's your turn. Questions, observations? So Jill, I like that notion of member approved tasks and events that feed back to the mission. I wonder how many people actually talk to their members about how they see the organization moving the mission. That's a great thought. Sometimes members aren't really sure what the mission is. So let's see. And Jill says her awards program is points-based, and points are good because they're countable. So Michelle suggests that they measure a lot of important administrative stuff, but they can be framed to focus on the mission impact of doing those things well. And Michelle, I think that's true, but I think it's also important that we find a way to put those things in the context of the mission and not let them be too salient. Shelley's asking for are there any methods or platforms we would recommend for sharing stuff out? And there are lots of BI, business intelligence platforms out there that have a wonderful way of graphically representing data. And way too often we tend to overload people with Excel spreadsheets with a bunch of numbers in them, and their eyes glaze over. So to the extent that you can use something like Tableau, T-A-B-L-E-A-U, and they have a free version that can help you present information graphically, I would certainly recommend doing that.
I'm sorry, Peter, this is Peggy. Listen, that's a great question that Shelley asked about what are methods and platforms you would measure. I'm wondering if folks in chat could throw in what's their answer to that. In other words, what methods or platforms are some of you guys using? Because there could be, this is the wisdom of the crowd, guys. It kind of helps us take a look at some of those things. So I just wanted to suggest that. And I also just wanted to mention, Peter, and maybe you can answer this question, is how can you incentivize chapters to provide information? Because Michelle's got that challenge, and several people on this have a challenge.
Yeah, Michelle, I sympathize, I empathize. That's not an easy nut to crack, because a lot of times, again, it comes back to who are we asking and what are we asking them for? And most importantly, why are we asking them for it? And most of the time I find that, particularly if your chapters are volunteer run, the administrative stuff is of the least interest to them and usually the most difficult for them to put together. So I would take a look at how you're asking for it. and what you're asking for, and ask for only the most important things. And the fewer things you ask for, the more likely you are to get them. And the perceived importance of those things to the mission, the more likely you are to get them. But when we ask volunteers to go through all kinds of crazy shenanigans and crazy calculations to give us a report, the odds are we're going to fight hard to get it. I think ultimately the best solution for that problem is a shared systems, common, whether they're your membership management systems, your accounting systems, to get them all on the same platform is a great way to go. We were doing some work with the Financial Planning Association last year, and they ran into that pandemic thing and sort of turned them sideways, but they had a wonderful concept called One FPA. And the whole idea was that they were bringing all of their chapters onto a common platform for accounting, for data management, for communications, for registrations. Everything was being run through a common system. The Appraisal Institute has a common system for all I would say the majority of their data management and their accounting at this point. More and more associations are moving in that direction for the very reason, Michelle, that you bring up. It's tough to get the volunteers or the execs to comply with a bunch of reporting requirements. So far better to have it done automatically, so they don't have to lift a finger to get it. And the advantage of doing that is the minute you do that, you have a common data taxonomy. You're all speaking the same language. 12 apples are 12 apples, not 5 aardvarks and 2 orangutans or whatever. And so you can both more easily compare across the system, but you're also speaking a common language then.
And Peter, to that point, let me ask a question that was put in the Q&A, and it's related to some things, but which is, so that we've got all of these metrics and we want to connect with them. What's the best way for us to communicate? How do we bring all of these variety of chapters in? And could there be something in the form of should this be in chapter leader orientation? Should it be in a guidebook? What are some of the effective practices for communicating and bringing people to the table, to the table for that?
So that's a great question, and it has lots of answers, some of which are going to work better for one organization or another. But I usually, I think, Peggy you and I usually suggest that we are really looking at there's not a solution. There are a number of solutions that really need to be worked together. The chapter leader program, whatever it may be, is certainly an opportunity to begin to educate people about what these things are and why they're important. But I think we need to look at this as a 24/7 exercise. We need to think about systems that are available on demand, because the reality is, particularly with volunteers, they're not paying attention to us nearly as much as we're paying attention to us. For me, I'm 24/7. I pay attention to myself all the time. For most chapter leaders, particularly if they're volunteers, we're getting about that much of their attention. So we need to make sure when we get that attention, we use it very well. And most importantly, we need to make sure that we allow them to dip in when it's most convenient for them. So I think a combination of a chapter portal, with real-time data reporting is useful. I think using the chapter leader program is great. I think using your outbound communications, whether the email, social media, whatever you're using to communicate with your chapter leaders, to on an ongoing basis, reinforcing, hey, here's how we're doing with our mission. Here's how you're doing with our mission. Here are things that we see that really excite us because there are other ways of moving that mission. Those kinds of communications, I think it's the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. And I think the more things that you can do, the more likely you are to help people become aware of what's important.
So Peter, we got 2 other questions, and it's really cool because many of these questions are coming in along sort of the same theme around this communications. And I loved how you emphasize multi-channel, because as you said, our volunteers are very, they're very distracted. But Monica said, so let's say that we've managed to get them all on the same page and they've done this, but now they're pushing back at how HQ is measuring them. So in other words, we've communicated some value to this about doing this process, but now they're possibly it's because they're unhappy with the thing. So I'm going to ask you that question, and I got one more question behind that.
Okay, so that's a great question, and Monica, there's an answer I'm going to point to, and this may be a little different than for some folks, but the Associated General Contractors, now they're a federation, so that's a little different. But this is what's really cool, is the federation, the chapter members got together and said, hey, we need to do a group assessment. We need to self-assess, right, and share that assessment across the entire system. It came from them. It didn't come from headquarters. Headquarters is in the conversation. And I think that the point I'm making here is that when you're putting these systems together, the extent to which you invite the chapter leadership to participate in the development of the system is going to have a direct impact on their willingness to participate. And the more ownership they have of how the system's designed, the questions it asks, the requirements it puts in place, the more likely you are to get compliance. If they feel like this is just something you've went into a back room and wrote a bunch of stuff down and said, hey, here are all the things you got to do, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, do them or you don't get any money. They're going to say, well, I'm not going to tell you what they're going to say because it's anyway. But I think getting them involved in the conversation from the get-go is critical to getting their ownership and their engagement and their compliance.
Yeah, Peter, would you agree that there's sort of two other pieces to that as well? One is the transparency of the data. So yep. What data am I using? How am I manipulating it? How am I pulling it together? And I think sometimes the pushback is because they don't understand the data. And I'm not a data person, people. So you have to kind of explain some things to me. So I think that kind of is a help. But I think the other thing, and we saw several things in the chat, Peter, and I had to go back. I think Jill was one of them, a couple people. If you are using the data for positivity, in other words, I saw a chat recently where someone said, as soon as they went out to their chapters and they said, here's this service that we're providing because you asked it, everybody was like, oh, wow, they listened. So maybe the pushback is because they don't see the outcome of that data. Right. So I wanted to bring those two things. But Peter, I also want to ask you one more question. This one comes from Anessa, and it's about, have we seen any chapters that have a subscription-based type of agreement with an association? So this is where, as I'm understanding, they sign up for services, and they're probably getting from HQ, and they pay it with a debit to their membership dues rebate. And I think she's just asking if we've seen that kind of thing. And maybe the cool thing about that is that might tie into kind of some benchmarking. You might have some shared data, but any comments to that?
So I don't know specifically of an association that's using what I would call a cafeteria system where the chapters can buy into different services. I know I've seen chatter about that, but I don't have any personal experience with associations that have done that. The question becomes, what's the basis upon which they decide what they need, and that's where the metrics are so important, because the metrics should be what drives that decision to select the service they may need. And I'll go back to this notion of not focusing so much on the how, but focusing on the results. And the advantage of a subscription service or a cafeteria program is they can really say, here are the things that we think we need to do to move the mission. Let's get the resources to make that happen. Let's not buy stuff we don't need. And that allows them to better use the limited resources they have at their disposal. So I think in principle, that sounds like a great idea. I'm not quite sure that I can share with you a specific example of anybody who's doing it. If anybody on the chat knows of anyone who's doing it, please let us know. Love to talk to them.
And Peter, let me ask you one last question. This came up in an earlier conversation I had with an association, and that was this conversation about the difference between approaching this reporting as benchmarking versus reporting. And of course, it gets to some of the things you've already sort of said, but it's kind of a little bit of a shift in the terminology. We used to say, okay, I'll do the annual report. And one of the things, which of course will be highlighted in the AGC story and the blog that's going to come into the on the Bill Highway post sometime this week, is this notion of benchmarking having a different flavor. Can you just say anything about that?
Well, and that was when I started working on this presentation, I was looking at the word benchmarking and going, okay, to what extent does that get my back up? Because as I said at the beginning, benchmarking, according to Webster, is we have standards against which we are being assessed or judged. And whenever somebody says they're going to judge you, you automatically, you put yourself into a hierarchical relationship. And I think the real key is maybe less the terminology than it is the ownership of the process. And that's why I'll emphasize, I think if the chapters feel like they own the process, in the case of AGC, the chapters own the process. It's not viewed as an us and them conversation. It's viewed as, hey, we're getting together to talk about how things are going and figure out how we can all take advantage of what's working well and what could be better.
So I think you have answered the questions that bubbled up, but there could be some additional questions, Peter. So I'm just kind of waiting to see if someone else it comes up. The last kind of question I want to ask you, and I guess we're segueing, moving a little bit, maybe pivoting a little bit off of the basic conversation, but is around the ROI question, because Mariner has done, you've done a bit more work on creating the ROI. And can you just real quickly mention the kind of questions or the data points maybe that fold up into an ROI, because there may be some cool connection here maybe?
Well, certainly the ROI process is very closely related to what we're talking about today. And the ROI matrix, the valuation process we put together really looks at how can we monetize the value that chapters create. And the question I asked in our CEO roundtables was, I bet every one of you can tell me to the penny how much you're spending to support your chapters in terms of payroll, programs, technology, et cetera. But show me on your P&L the income side, the number on the income side that justifies that amount. And nobody can, because they haven't really monetized the value. They haven't counted the value in a way that can be translated into a dollar amount that justifies however much they're spending. So if you go to the Mariner website or just Google Mariner ROI and chapters, you'll see a series of areas that we look at in the valuation matrix. And they're all about the things that we're counting that chapters may or may not be doing. Not to suggest that chapters should do all those things. It's just we want to take a look at the things they are doing and see how well they're doing and what difference they're making. Again, the tying it back to the mission, I think, is the central message that I want to bring today. That if we can't tie it back to the mission, we're not going to get the volunteers excited about pulling this train. So let's keep this train moving, speaking of which, and just do one last word from our sponsors. Of course, that's Bill Highway, who is really great at getting the data together for you. And of course, the folks here at Mariner, we're all about helping you understand what that data means. And I think together, we put together a pretty good team to help support the chapter community, because our goal, again, we give stuff away like crazy. Our goal is for the associations that manage and use chapters as a critical part of the ecosystem. We want them to be the best they can be. That's what we're all about. So thank you very much to everybody. Drive your chapter behavior with targeted benchmarking by measuring what matters. Thank you.
Right. And last thing I want to just mention is the chapter benchmarking study will be coming out in a couple of months. And so stay tuned, because we want to have you all involved and engaged in that. Peter, big round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being our content lead today. And y'all have a good time now. See you guys next month. We'll talk training.